catback exhaust. Okay, now I'm going to put intakes. It's like it's the same basic formula for everybody who starts modifying their car. That's where I started. That's where everybody starts. And then you spend all this time tuning, expect that you're going to get these huge gains, and then you don't. So why don't we start with how optimal are the stock intakes on the VQ37?
I feel like the way to answer just about any breathing question is by talking about intake manifold vacuum. So when the engine is taking in air, it's happening because the intake valve obviously is open and the piston is moving down and it's trying to capture all that air. And so when the piston, let me go grab a piston. When the piston is moving down and the intake valve is open, the exhaust valve is closed in that instance, this creates vacuum in here. There's like a suction effect that's happening. The only place air can go in from is from here, from this square opening right here, right? So now, if you imagine there's a plastic manifold on top of this that feeds all 6 of these runners here, and there's 2 throttle bodies. And we know that, right? We know that the VQ has the dual throttle bodies. Those 2 throttle bodies have plates inside. And imagine if those plates are closed and that valve is open and the piston's moving down, it's going to create a lot of vacuum in this area because that piston, as it's moving down, it's displacing all that air, and now there's a vacuum there, and it's going to try to suck the air in, right? When the throttle plate's open, it's still drawing the same amount of air in, but vacuum in the sense is like the suction effect, right? So if you were to put your hand on one of these openings when the throttle is fully open, you wouldn't really nearly feel anything like you would if the throttle plates were closed, and then let's say you pull a hose off, you put your finger in there, you'll feel it sucking on that finger. You'll feel like the suction effect. That's the vacuum, right? So now imagine you're going full throttle and the engine is sucking tons of air through. The throttle is fully open. If you took a measurement of the air pressure inside the intake manifold, the ideal case would be pretty much at or near atmosphere, which is like running with no intake. You want to equalize that pressure. So if you do a pull, full throttle fully open, all the way to red line, and you look at your vacuum that's currently present in the intake manifold, you'll find that as the airflow, the CFM requirement increases, how much air you're consuming increases, the engine will tend to build more vacuum in the plenum, even though the throttle is open, because it can't ingest enough air quickly enough to digest that. So that in itself, once you start getting that restriction, because there's not enough flow, is when you start to build vacuum. So remember, there's a relationship between vacuum and restriction. More restriction means more vacuum, right? But the idea is, you got all this air coming in, we want to reduce the restriction, we want to get away from vacuum and get more towards atmosphere, right? Sure. But engines don't spend the majority of their lives sitting there unless they're dedicated race vehicles, right? Somebody who's going out on the strip or they're going somewhere, they're sitting at high RPM the whole time. Sure, I can see the case for that. The thing that happens though is when you increase, if you plot how much vacuum you have in the manifold versus your RPM, full throttle, right? You start at, let's say, 2,000 or something, and all the way to red line. You'll find that as you approach red line, you're going to make more and more vacuum, which you don't really want that, right? I mean, some of that's going to be natural because you want the engine to pull more air in, but at the same time, you don't want too much such that it's a restriction at that point, right? You would expect that if you had a better flowing intake, you'd be making less vacuum in general, which is true. The disadvantage of putting a larger, higher flowing intake system on is that when the engine is already at atmosphere and it's not making vacuum, and you put a larger intake on it, what you're doing, and this is from a flow perspective, is because the quantity of air isn't changing, you're still getting the same quantity. You're not getting a benefit as far as additional flow. You don't need it, right? Like 2,000 RPM or something. You don't have to reach intakes for that, right? But what's going to happen is that the speed with which the air will travel into the manifold will be reduced. So you have the same, imagine this, you have the same quantity of gas coming, air as being the gas, is coming in, but now it is more widely dispersed. So those molecules, those air molecules don't have to rush at the same speed. They can slow down and the engine will take in the correct quantity of air. It's not going to, more air isn't going to come in.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be the same amount of air, but now it's a larger pipe, so naturally the speed's going to be reduced. Right?
It's like that with liquid and piping.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
you want
like
a higher,
liquid and
stronger
piping.
stream, you need to tighten the opening a little, like when you're
Absolutely.
washing your car.
Like
right?
you're washing your car, you put your thumb at the end of the thing.
Yeah, and
makes
you
it
get
come
that
out
wide.
faster.
Exactly. Now, why this is important is because in a naturally aspirated vehicle, there's no forced induction. Your only induction that you're really going to have is going to come from the vacuum that the engine is making, and also from a scavenging effect that comes from the exhaust system, which is a different thing, and that requires valve overlap, and we're not going to get into that yet. So on a car with the larger air boxes, or intakes I should say, or let's not even say that way, on a car where you've reduced the intake restriction, you generally have, assuming it's a fixed intake restriction, you've generally de-optimized the car for low end torque because you've reduced the cylinder fill effect. Okay? And so somebody who spends most of their time doing daily driving would be better off with stock intakes.